Hello, this is Samsa again from GamingOnLinux.com, and today I'm taking a look at RymdResa. I'm going to say it like that because it's Swedish and that's the only way I can pronounce Swedish things, so you're going to have to live with that. Anyway, RymdResa is an artistic indie roguelike space odyssey with some RPG elements. That's pretty much how it describes itself, where you guide an astronaut in search of a new home after his planet is destroyed, so you're looking for another planet to, inhabit or something like that. On this quest you only have a limited amount of resources, and there are various kinds of dangers that will end up depleting them, including, just flying around, which is pretty much what you do most of the time. You pretty much guide this ship of yours, and you're searching for a new home somewhere in the stars, and you basically deplete these resources of yours simply by accelerating. And accelerating is pretty important because there are actually many dangers that you need to avoid, including asteroids and later even mines and nasty aliens that will try to blow up your ship. And like I mentioned, this is pretty much an artistic experience. There is a lot of artsy stuff in the game, and for example, the game occasionally gives you these diary entries from the pilot, and essentially they are poems, and they describe what the astronaut is thinking, what his daily routines are, etc, etc, and it's basically poems. Like I mentioned, the game describes itself as a roguelike. That's not exactly true, but it does have some elements of that. For example, the world is randomized, and there are various kinds of randomized dangers and events, and the events don't play the same way every single time, so it's slightly different each time around. But like I mentioned, it's not really a roguelike. For example, the roguelike, first of all, it's not a roguelike at all. A roguelike is something very specific. This is more like a roguelite, but I don't think it's even that, because the game doesn't really have permadeath unless you turn it up to the highest difficulty, and in that case you will actually have pretty much permadeath. The game is split into 3 chapters, and if you die on hardcore mode, it takes you back to the first, not the first chapter, but to the beginning of the chapter you're in. So it's not full permadeath, but it's closer. On normal it doesn't even, you don't get penalized at all if you die, so pretty much not a roguelite at all. Like I mentioned, most of the time you are basically just flying around trying to reach various kinds of destinations. The game does have quests, and each of the chapters consists of a main quest that you need to complete, and then there are, I think, a couple of sort of side quest types of things. But I never really ended up doing them too much. I focus mainly on the main quests, and the main quests seem to revolve around gathering materials and items. Sometimes you need to just travel to random places, find enough materials around, and then go back. Sometimes you have set coordinates which contain some sort of an important item that you need to fetch. And as you might imagine, it does get quite boring. On the way to your destination, you only really need to avoid these asteroids and mines. Later on, there will be enemies with a little bit more AI, so they will try to attack you just a little bit, and it does mean that you need to avoid a little bit better, because you're not just avoiding some random pot of debris that is flying in a certain direction. But that's pretty much the only thing you can do on your way to some location, and there's not really much else. You do have those random events like I mentioned, so you can encounter various kinds of spacecrafts and planets, and you can sort of explore them, which means that an event triggers, which is sort of like in FTL, where it basically it details some sort of an event, and then it gives you 2 options, and depending on your luck, your option might actually end up yielding good results, or you might get penalized for picking the wrong one in that situation. It's a little bit random, so they do play out differently each time. Like I mentioned, you also hear these diary entries during your flight, and it brings a little bit of change to the otherwise monotonous flying. However, there is a bit of a problem with the diary entries. They are basically played in a random order, so they are not like you don't play this one and then you play this entry and then you play this entry, so it doesn't really help with the whole narrative. Also, there's the problem that once it plays an entry, it doesn't, get added to a list of entries not to play again, so it basically ends up replaying these diary entries over time. So I ended up hearing the same entries multiple times, and that was definitely very annoying. Luckily you can mute them, but it definitely doesn't help the narrative experience. And the story overall, the story was okay-ish. The other narrative elements are the cinematics at the beginning and at the end of each chapter, and the first 2 chapters, they were pretty fine. I'm not going to spoil the story for you. They were okay. The 3rd chapter was definitely weird, and I had no idea what was really going on. So I think the story kind of fell apart on the 3rd chapter. I think they did too much stuff too quickly, so I kind of, I didn't really know what was going on in the end. So the story, not too great in my opinion. You can also, on your way to these various destinations, you can find equipment and items that you can equip various kinds of additional engines. You can find shields for your ship, which also they definitely help you when you're dealing with asteroids and stuff like that. But in my opinion, the equipment system wasn't too great either. Most of the items deal with acceleration and maximum speed, which is pretty much the only thing you apparently care about in space. It's just going fast. Some items also have a benefit to finding more items, so it appears that you're mainly equipping items so that you can go fast and find more items. The equipment isn't simply interesting in my opinion. There are a couple of consumable items, and they were more interesting. So, for example, they could be used to destroy all dangers on the screen, they could be used to transport you back to your base. You could use them to give you a boost of resources if you're running low, all kinds of things like that. And that was definitely better than just the random equipable items. But I didn't find the whole inventory system all that interesting, to be honest. I don't really like to tweak it with, a whole bunch of items to begin with, so it wasn't too great here. You can also research. You just need to find the research object or research item, and that allows you to research items, which basically grants you more features, more consumables and things like that. But honestly, the research, I didn't find it all that fun either. It basically just involves you finding the research item and then spending these space points, which are kind of like a score. You get space points by doing the quests, doing well in the events and stuff like that. So you spend a little bit of the space points and you can unlock a new consumable and stuff like that. Some of the items are also named fairly weirdly, so they were a little bit unclear with their their functionality. For example, there are these things called sentries in the game, and normally sentry would mean like a turret that automatically shoots at enemies or something like that, but the sentries in RymdResa don't really do that. They are basically a compass, as far as I know. I never really figured out what the sentry stat really did, but as far as I know, it was basically just a compass. I think some of the stuff should have been made a little bit more clear. It could be that there's a manual that explains all these things, but I didn't end up seeing that one. I didn't read the in-game tutorial, which I probably should have done, but it was fairly long, so I decided to instead just play the game and see if I can figure it out that way. In addition to, just items and the items granting you various kinds of stats, you also have different ships you can fly. The default ship is fairly mediocre. It doesn't do too well. It's not too durable, but it's okay when it comes to speed. There are other ships that you can you can fly them if you have enough space points. So every time you die, you can spend some space points and that will grant you the ability to fly different ships. And these different ships tend to be either more durable or faster than the default one. And the default one obviously doesn't cost you anything, so you don't need to worry about it if you don't have any space points or something like that. But I really ended up only using about 3 of the ships. There are 8 in total, but they didn't seem too interesting. Like, there's one of the ships is very durable, it takes less damage, and that was what I mostly used. And there was also another one which was faster. Some of the items are also only available for certain ships, and that means that you might want to use one of these ships if you have gathered interesting kinds of equipable items for them. But otherwise, they didn't feel too interesting. Each of these ships also appears to have their own little soundtrack, so the soundtrack is slightly different for each of the ships. And the soundtrack for this game is actually fairly good. I did feel like it was worth listening to, and definitely made, journeying through the stars a lot easier when you had like music playing. If there was no music, I probably would have rage quit after like 45 minutes or so. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about the ending. I talked to you about the story a bit, but I'll talk to you about the ending too. I'm not going to spoil it, but I do need to say a couple of things. First of all, the events leading to the ending were fairly dreadful. So, the ending basically consists of 3 bosses you need to beat. Up to this point, the game has had no bosses whatsoever. But right at the end, it has 3 of them, and they are like right after each other. And because this game is basically non-violent, you don't fight them. Instead, each of them has about 15 questions that you need to get correct. And it's basically, each of the questions has 2 options, and you need to pick the right ones. If you pick the wrong one, you take damage. If you take too much damage, you die, and if you're playing on hardcore, you get sent to the beginning of the chapter. In other cases, you might lose a little bit of space points, or just get booted back to the base, and you need to make your way back to the boss, and then you need to answer the same questions again. It's basically guesswork. As far as I know, there were no ways to get the questions correctly. Some of them are simply left or right. How are you supposed to get that correctly? Some of them you can sort of maybe work out the correct answer, but some of them are simply do this or do that, and you have no idea which one is going to be the correct one. So I don't think you can be able to complete those bosses with skill. It requires trial and error. And that's a problem for me. I think that the bosses could have been scrapped entirely. There was no reason for those bosses being there, and yeah, it was just terrible. I ended up wasting so much time on that, and I got really, really annoyed by it. In the end, I ended up using notebook paper to record my answers so that I would get them correctly next time around, but it still took me maybe 3 attempts per each boss to get them correctly. And it was just an annoyance. I have no idea why the devs decided to put that in there, but it's bad. The ending itself is quite weird, and like I mentioned, the 3rd chapter, all in all, was just weird. I don't really know what happened, and I don't really know why it happened. Maybe I didn't pay much attention, maybe I skipped some diary entries that might have explained it a little bit, but in my opinion it just went in a weird direction way too quickly, so I was unable to keep up with the whole thing. The game does have a couple of redeeming qualities, however. I am pretty much bashing it at this point, but I do have to mention positives too. So I didn't really have too many problems running the game. There were a couple of graphical glitches where the screen would shift into it would shift up, or it would shift to one side a little bit. That was a little bit annoying, but it only happened when I played for extended periods of time, and I'm guessing it probably has something to do with the screen shake effect they are using, so that the screen doesn't get reset properly and it just gets like slightly offset. And the game also has low hardware requirements. Basically anything you can basically reuse these days pretty much probably runs this game. The hardware requirements were really low. It didn't even specify the 3D capabilities too much. It simply said you need a 3D capable card, so I'm guessing something that can achieve OpenGL 3 at this point. So pretty much anything integrated that is fairly modern. Also, I mentioned the soundtrack. The soundtrack is pretty good and it's fairly relaxing. I enjoyed the soundtrack, it was cool. But in conclusion, I think the developers might have spent too much time on the art and not enough on the fun. The game, in my opinion, was fairly tedious and also a fairly slow experience. It involved a bunch of grinding, and as a 6-hour experience, I think like that's maybe too much for the stuff they really wanted to do here. The story didn't really work too well, and particularly because it was slightly randomized, so the events were random and the diary entries came in a random order. I think that definitely didn't help the game. I don't personally see much reason to buy the game. I would like to note that I am in the minority when it comes to this opinion, and apparently the game has a fairly reasonable 86% approval rate on Steam, so I don't think everyone will share my opinion on this, but I personally didn't find it fun. I found it to be boring, the mechanics weren't too great, and yeah, pretty much I would only recommend this game to you if you're after an artistic experience. Like really you're after an artistic experience and you are a fan of poetry. I cannot guarantee that the poetry is good, because I am not an arts expert at all. I am not even any expert when it comes to, gaming, to be entirely honest. So I cannot really guarantee any of that stuff, but definitely the artistic experience here is probably worth more than the gameplay experience. So I personally will not recommend this game to you. I mean, if you feel like going completely crazy with your money, then maybe buy it when it's on sale or something. But personally, I don't think it's worth your money. It's not worth like 12 euros that it costs. And I cannot see myself replaying it. And I definitely don't think that the 6 hours I spent on the game were really worth it. Anyway, that's it for RymdResa, and hopefully you enjoyed this video, and we will see in future videos at some point. Goodbye.